What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Tech Backstage and happy Thursday. We're almost there to the end of the week. Today, really excited. We got a very special guest today. We're going to take a detour away from talking about software products for a little bit. And we have Carl Dietrich from JumpAero today. Carl, how you doing?
Great. Happy to be here, Eddie.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you, and I'm really excited to be talking about the work that you're doing at JumpAero right now. This is definitely not something that we talk about typically on this show, but definitely falls into the category of technology and future tech and things that are happening and changing the world. We always like to talk about stuff that's taking the world in a positive direction, right? So I'm really excited to jump into this, and not to mention. We're not going to introduce the topic yet because we don't want to spoil the surprise. But I think this is something that me, along with pretty much everybody else in the world, is like, hey, when is this actually going to happen? Right. So, anyways, before we jump into that, let's talk a little bit about you. Let's talk about your background, how you got to Jump Arrow, but, where did you come from? How did you get into this industry? And then, you know, how did you get to Jump Arrow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a Bay Area kid, grew up in the North Bay, and from a very young age, I was fascinated with airplanes, like many other little kids. I started saving up for my pilot's license when I was about 8 years old. I was inspired by like Top Gun, Back to the Future, all these futuristic movies. But I got really into it and, wound up designing and building and crashing my own remote controlled airplanes. And then wound up going to MIT to study aerospace engineering, wound up being there for a whole lot longer than I expected. I was there from about 95 to 2006, picking up a few degrees along the way and learning all about entrepreneurship and getting new companies off the ground, which was something that I think I was kind of pre-programmed to do growing up in the Bay Area. So when 2006 came around, there had been some recent rule changes that happened in the aviation world that made it look like maybe we could do something new and get it through the regulatory hurdles that you have to do something novel in aviation, in personal aviation, like the general aviation industry, little airplanes, Cessnas and stuff like that. So we set out to do something that a number of people had tried before, but had consistently failed. We were doing it with some new technology, though, some new materials, some new electronics. We were making a combined flying driving vehicle. We made an airplane that was like a little Cessna or Piper that could fold up its wings, drive down the road, met Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, so safety cage, crumple zones, airbags, all these other things. So we developed that product over the course of about a decade. It takes quite a while to develop those types of complex vehicle systems and ensure that they meet the necessary levels of safety. And our company, Terrafugia, was acquired by the parent company of Volvo and Lotus, the Zhejiang Geely Holding Group.
Wow.
This was back in 2017. And after the acquisition, I stayed on for a couple of years. I was the founding CEO, CTO of Terrafugia, and I helped hire my replacement as a global CEO. And I stayed on as the CTO and set up a global R&D center actually out in the San Francisco Bay Area here for Terrafugia post-acquisition. Stayed on for a couple of years. And then the new parent company took the company in a different direction that I really wasn't on board with. And by that point, I had become really familiar with what was going on in what has been named the advanced air mobility space. This area, since Terrafugia was founded, has really taken off. There, just over the past 5 years, over $15 billion has been invested in advanced mobility products.
That's incredible.
There have been like a handful of SPACs. Frankly, they haven't done very well in public because they're still not, doing these air taxi operations that they were designed to do. But I wound up getting really familiar with a lot of this stuff and spent years developing a combination of technologies and business models and evaluating, the pros and cons of air taxis, which is sort of what the general public will likely experience before they experience a personal flying car. Uh,
Mhm.
it will likely be an air taxi type vehicle. And a lot of that is driven by cost. Like the cost of these
Right.
things generally pretty high. So the average person can't afford their own one, but with shared use, you can actually bring costs down and make it something that people can use, like for instance, to get to the airport, right?
Mhm.
So if you live in a suburb, or if you live like over in the East Bay and you've got a flight out of SFO or something like that, a few years from now, you may be able to get an air taxi to the airport and then get on your commercial flight wherever you're going. Um,
Incredible.
so there are a lot of companies developing vehicles to do this. The cool thing about these vehicles now is most of them are all electric, right?
Okay.
So there are no emissions, and it helps make them quieter. It helps make them more. It's easier to make a robust system because you can have distributed propulsion systems that, if you have any one failure, it's not a big deal. The aircraft can still land normally and all that sort of thing. And a lot of them take off and land vertically, so sort of like a helicopter.
Okay.
So it's not quite Back to the Future, but it's
Right.
getting there. It's actually getting pretty close to that vision of like that vertical takeoff and landing and like take you where you want to go, flying car future that we were all kind of promised as kids.
That's incredible. So I guess the first thing that I want to highlight here, and you know, the thing that's mind blowing to me is this is your second startup in the space, right? Like that's the first thing that's mind blowing to me because I think I was telling you this backstage, but like I'm still waiting for like the Fifth Element, like version of 2022 where it's like I just walk
Yeah,
outside, get in my car, and take off, or like the Jetsons. I mean, I don't know. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that I think George Jetson was born in 2022, or he was born in the 2020s. So it's like we're
yeah,
getting there, right? Like we're waiting for
right.
sky homes and we're waiting for like air cars. And the fact that you had a startup in this space going back to 2006 is mind-blowing to me because there's a lot of us that are interested in this stuff, and I think there's a lot of people that are like, hey, when's this going to happen? But also I think you highlighted this kind of like high level, but there's hard problems that you have to solve to make this
Yeah,
work, right? This is not like you can't just, be driving down the 5 and then decide, "Oh, I don't like traffic. I'm going to take off right here," right?
right.
So tell me a little bit like before we actually dive into, the topic, but like tell me a little bit about you said some things changed in 2006. Could you maybe highlight a couple of the things that started to open up this industry towards
Yeah.
being more accessible to the general public, and then what actually opened it up to be available for this? Because I think that's a really important thing to start talking about.
Sure.
The topic.
Sure. So I'm going to take a couple years before that. Actually, in 2004, the FAA created what was called the Sport Pilot Light Sport Aircraft Rule, which created both a new way of getting a pilot's license that took half the time and half the money, and created a new way of bringing aircraft products, small aircraft products, to market that were based upon compliance with industry standards. Um, as opposed to traditional FAA certification, which is very prescriptive and takes an incredible amount of time to get through. Um, Basically, the standards didn't change. It's just that the way that you navigate and the way that you demonstrate that you met the standards changed. So it's sort of like you know um, procedural stuff, which doesn't
Hmm.
sound like a big deal, but in the aviation world, everything is certification procedures. How do you prove that this is safe, right? How do you
Hmm.
prove that this? So it turns out that those kind of nitpicky details make a huge difference
Right.
in how long it takes to develop a product, how much money it takes, yeah, and whether it is a good investment or not. Really, is
Hmm.
is the bottom line. So in 2004, when the FAA made that rule change, it was their first venture into using industry consensus standards as what we call means of compliance with the safety intent of the regulations. So they it, it was the opening of the door. And at that time, you also had new technologies, like of course we had the emergence of what we call glass cockpits into general aviation. So these are LCD displays, not that big, but daylight readable LCD displays that would give you all of what was your traditional 6-pack of steam gauges in the old style aircraft, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that technology had been matured, and by that point, and so and along with that, you had GPS navigation features that were baked into a lot of the products. And turns out, if you learn how to fly, one of the hardest things to do when you're learning how to fly is to navigate without any GPS, right? So we're so reliant, we're so accustomed to GPS, but as a pilot, you got to know what to do if your GPS gives out. If a solar flare takes out the GPS system, blah blah blah, you got to be able to deal with that, right? So
Right.
there's a lot of those sort of what if scenarios that you have to deal with in aviation, right? So this is a lot of the background as to why we don't have flying cars today, right?
Right.
It's all of those things that we were talking about. Safety, it's the process of proving safety, certifying the things, and the technology as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was what was going on in 2004. Flash forward a decade, uh, and another major rule change happens. The FAA changes the way they traditionally certify aircraft. They update the Part 23 regulation set, which is just it's how they certify small airplanes in general.
Okay.
And so we've had a series of these regulatory changes that have opened the doors. And now we also have battery electric aircraft technology, right? Propulsion systems based on electric motors and batteries and things of that nature, that while they can't go as far as traditional hydrocarbon engines, they have the potential of being distributed and not taking an efficiency penalty for having like multiple propellers and motors. Whereas if you have a lot of small jet engines, they're not very efficient. So you never want to do
Right.
that. Right? But you can do that with electric motors and propellers and stuff like that. And you don't take a big efficiency hit. So that opens up new configurations of airplanes,
Mm-hmm.
new designs. And so as a consequence of that, we've seen literally over 600 published designs
Wow.
for electric and hybrid electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft come out over the past 6-7 years now. So it's been truly a revolution. And we look at things in the aviation industry as like there are some big revolutions, right? There were the Wright brothers back in 1903. There was the advent of aluminum construction aircraft, from moving from wood and fabric to aluminum. That was a big deal for aircraft. And then there was the jet age, right?
Right.
So like those are kind of big milestones that you can look at, and those technology changes changed everything about aviation.
Mm-hmm.
What we are experiencing today with the advent of electric propulsion systems and distributed electric propulsion systems is the next big revolution in aviation.
Right.
And it's going to be really exciting to see what happens over the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to see a lot of these aircraft come out that are going to look nothing like previous aircraft that you see today.
That's
So
incredible.
really cool.
And also, like, just to highlight, like, you guys have already built these things. Like I said, this is like your second startup. So you've already
Yeah.
built flying cars.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At Terrafugia, we built 3 generations of combined flying driving vehicles. Those products had a hybrid electric system because the battery technology wasn't quite there yet when we were doing them. But at JumpAero, we're doing an all-electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And one of the things that we found at Terrafugia, the previous venture, is we encountered these cost issues also. Because the other thing about a massive change like this is that you've got infrastructure issues, you've got supply chain issues, you've got all sorts of issues, and it takes time for the whole industry to change.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, the mindset of the customer, right?
Right.
Like nobody's out there buying flights on air taxis today, right? But they
Mhm.
will be in 5 years. So maybe even sooner than that. So we're going to see some of this change start to occur, but the background, the tier 2, the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers are not yet changed. They're still working in the automotive world and the mainstream aerospace world. They haven't adjusted yet to this new reality. So costs are still high for doing these kinds of new things. And that that slows down the rate of mass adoption when your cost barrier is still high. So you have to come up with creative business models that can
Right.
account for the reality that in the next few years, the costs are still going to be high, right?
Yeah.
But what can we do with this today where it's less cost sensitive applications? So what we're doing at JumpAero is we're focused on using an all electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft for first response applications. So we're using it in time sensitive situations
Right.
where, you've had a cardiac arrest, heart attack, or something like that, and you call 911 and you live in a rural area and you just need that first responder to get there as quickly as possible. Your life is on the line, right?
Yep.
That's what we see as a great early use case for this technology, because not only can we get there in half the time of an ambulance today, particularly in rural areas, and potentially save tens of thousands of lives per year just in the United States, but we can actually show the world that this technology has incredible value and has the potential to do a lot of good for
Right.
society. So
That I think that's incredible. And I one thing I want to ask you really quick, why the first responders space? Why was that the first, industry that you guys looked at to, to deploy, JumpAero?
yeah, two big reasons. So one is that, like I said, in the near term, the underlying cost of the service is going to be higher than it will be in the long run. So you want to start with industries where it's less cost sensitive than a
Right.
taxi ride, or like Uber, right? Like Uber is out there. It's always going to be the competitor for the taxi, right? So until you can compete with that price point, which some of these air taxi concepts have definitely the potential to compete with them, but in the near future, they're likely going to be more expensive. And that's going to keep it as something that's not yet a mass market kind of thing, right? So we need to focus on the applications that are less cost sensitive at the beginning. And first response in this particular application is less cost sensitive because the insurance industry, like if you have a cardiac arrest, the insurance industry values those few minutes
Of
at
course.
about $1,000 a minute.
Wow.
Okay. Like, so that isn't, because it can affect the long-term care for that patient. If you have oxygen not getting to your brain for 4 more minutes, you're going to have a lot more brain damage. You're going to need a lot more care in the hospital. The insurance industry is going to be paying for that. Right.
Right.
So by getting the first responder to the scene faster, we can save the insurance industry literally billions of dollars a year.
Wow.
And just in the rural areas, it's over $4 billion a year. If we start factoring in suburban areas, we get up over $10 billion a year in terms of savings to the insurance industry. So it's huge potential. And because the value of that time is so astronomically high, it's something where, if we're off in our initial cost estimate, it's not going to be the end of the business. Whereas the air taxi market, if you're off in that cost estimate by 10, 20%, you can have a much, much smaller market than you did before. It's just a very price sensitive. And that's what we learned at Terrafugia. Basically, we learned that, hey, if you're trying to do a consumer product right out of the gate, it's going to be really hard because that is a cost sensitive market, right?
Oh, yeah. 100%.
So we don't want to start with that at JumpAero. I learned that lesson the hard way, right? We're going to start with something where we can add a hell of a lot of value, and we're going to where it's just less cost sensitive because people's lives are on the line, right?
Yeah.
Like that's really what it comes down to. That's when you have the least cost sensitivity, right? Is like if it's the difference between life and death.
Right. Well, and I think, you make a really good point, like if the insurance industry is like, well, hey, if you can get there 3 minutes faster, but it costs X amount of dollars more, of course they're going to be willing to pay for that because otherwise they're going to be paying for the long-term care. So for them, it's almost a common sense problem that you're solving. Is like, well, hey, if you can get there faster, that's great, especially in rural areas, right?
And the issue is literally nobody can do it today. One of the beauties of all electric propulsion for this is that unlike a traditional hydrocarbon engine where you have to warm up your engine and similarly you have to cool it down. Otherwise you thermally cycle the engine and it won't last as long, right? With an all electric, I can go to full power instantly. What that means is that my startup sequence can be much, much shorter, right? And I can go to full power and I can do rapid response missions that I cannot do today in a helicopter. That's the key thing, right? So this is it. It's great that the all electric propulsion is green. I love it. I love it that we could be entirely solar powered. That's awesome. But the economics are driven by what can you do, right? What
Right.
can you do that hasn't been done before? And what we can do with an all electric vertical takeoff landing aircraft that hasn't been done before is we can deploy way faster. And
Yeah.
that means we can get to the scene faster than
Yep.
anything that's traditionally powered,
Yeah,
right?
and there's a lot of advancements in the electric battery space as well. I have a
Yeah.
friend who she's a chemical engineer and she works for GM working on all sorts of top secret stuff that I have no idea how any of it works. But and I'm probably going to butcher this, but the other day I read that they're working on what I believe now is a lithium sulfite battery, which actually reduces the size and the weight, but also allows you to extend the actual charge and the life of the battery. So you actually could get, three times a day. I can't remember the stat. So I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to probably not quote too much of this, but sounded like for the same size of battery, you could almost get three times the distance. But then the other thing is it based there in some of the early trials that they're seeing right now is that those batteries actually aren't losing their potency, their charge over extended periods of time.
That's huge, and that's usually one of the big issues with the lithium sulfur type technology is how many cycles will you get out of it? Because there are lots of cells in the laboratory that have 2 times the specific energy of cells that you can buy off the shelf today. But they often won't have they won't be in a production packaging and stuff like that,
Yep.
and they won't have the cycle life potential. The cycle life drives the cost,
Yep.
right? How often do you have to replace that battery pack is a huge factor if you're the operator of that aircraft, right?
Yep.
That's because that battery pack is going to be expensive, right?
Of
So
course.
so that all factors into the underlying economics of that air taxi business model.
Yep.
There are a bunch of factors, and there's also the autonomy factor, right? Which is another big thing that is coming into the picture now in this space, and that's sort of part of that promise of the flying car of the future. Is that hey, in the future you don't have to be a pilot, right?
Right.
We do today, but
Yeah.
in the future we don't expect to need all that same level of training.
And I think that's a really good point too. And I think that actually we could probably kind of segue because I want to spend a little bit more time than usual on the future tech side of this conversation because this industry, even though it's been around for what do we say 16 years now, we're really just starting to get to what I think, like, I mean, you guys have been building flying cars for years now, but we're finally getting to the point, which is what we're talking about today, is like, how close are we to the vision of flying cars?
Right.
And I think it's incredible that you guys are doing flying taxis and but common folk like me are like, well, yeah, but when can I buy one and use it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I want to shift a little bit and talk about what are some of the things that you think need to happen between where we're at now with the technology and where we need to go in order for this to hit the consumer market? Because you're 100% right, and this is something I talk to a lot of people about. When you're building applications, consumer apps are hard. It's typically a saturated market, and I mean, you guys are building a product. I'm talking about, like, building software and apps, but I think it's very similar in terms of the financials. Is consumer apps, or consumer markets are saturated. They don't have as much money as businesses. B2B, there's always more money. There's always, you can get longer contracts, and if you can prove out the feasibility of it, they're going to sign up and buy a bunch of them, right? But
Yep.
what's it going to take to get from where we are right now, which is focusing on specific use cases and specific industries that are can afford it, to
Yep.
Eddie being able to go into a dealership and swipe his credit card and fly out in his car.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are a bunch of challenges that we've got to overcome. I mean, you hit on it. Cost is like the big thing, right? How do we get the cost down? Well, we get the cost down by maturing the supply chain for this new set of technology, and and it's not there yet. And we also have to deal with infrastructure issues, right? Charging for these vehicles, depending upon the size of the vehicle that you're talking about. For some of these air taxis, the chargers for them are like the size of, they're like 600 kilowatt chargers. They're huge things,
Whoa.
right? Like they're like, this is not something that you would have in your garage, right?
Right.
For a personal one-person thing, they can be much smaller. They can be much more like your car charger, like a level 1, level 2 type car charger. So you got infrastructure issues, you've got cost, supply chain issues, you've got regulatory issues also, right? The regulations have been evolving quite a bit, but the regulations do not evolve quickly because their priority is safety. That's it. They don't care about your return on investment. They care about public safety. That is all they care about. They don't care about how much longer it takes you. And the regulations have been maturing, but I will say they are not all the way there yet. Like I've been in this space for a long time, and we've seen some good progress by the FAA and EASA in Europe and CAAC in China and yada, 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 yada. But they're not where they need to be to enable the flying car future for the average person, right? It's just not there, right? How do you certify an autonomous flight control system? Nobody knows. Nobody knows right now. I will tell you that, like, and that's a huge issue, right? Like, if you can't certify it, you can't sell it in aviation, right? So I will say there are some loopholes. So if you're willing to build one yourself, you could have one right now. So there are ways of getting around things where that exist in the existing regulatory structure. So it all depends on how much you want it, really.
Right.
So,
so what happens, like, let's say, we go and decide to build one ourselves, right? But okay, so you got it, but aren't there airspace regulations and stuff that you have to follow?
You would have to become a pilot. You would have to learn about all of that. You would have to, look at your sectional charts and figure out, okay, can I take this flight? What airspace am I going to be going through? All that sort of stuff that in the future, obviously, we don't want the average person to have to worry about. The vehicle just takes care of all that stuff, right?
Right.
But today, you would have to become a pilot. You would have to build the aircraft yourself. All right.
Yeah.
And so obviously those are huge barriers, right? So it's not, this is why we don't have these things out there. This is why there's no commercial market, not a large individual ownership market today. And why applications like what we're doing at JumpAero and why applications like the air taxi application are likely to come first, because we can then drive the maturation of the regulations, the maturation of the supply chain, the adjustment of the supply chain that can all affect, and also the air traffic control system, right? What we're talking about here, how do we make sure that the FAA's air traffic control system knows how to work with an autonomous flying car? Today, they have no idea. It's not on the table. You can't do it. You as a pilot are in charge of talking on the radio to ATC if you're in certain airspace. Right?
It's mind blowing to me. A buddy of mine lives in Southern California, but we used to fly around in Austin all the time. He was a pilot, and one time I had to go to LA. He's like, "I'll take you." I'm like, "Okay." And so we hopped in a little Cessna and flew from Austin all the way to Los Angeles. But it's mind blowing to me how, it's really like the Wild West once you get up there. It's especially I remember we had to stop for gas somewhere in New Mexico or something like that. And I remember, you're clicking the button to turn the lights on and off at some unmanned airfield, and you're making announcements, and there's literally nobody home. You're just announcing it to let them know, hey, I'm here and I'm landing, but nobody's paying attention outside of major airspaces. And if you want to land at LAX or at Austin Bergstrom, so. It was kind of mind blowing to me that we could just be up there, doing whatever we want to. And nobody was really paying attention.
Well, there's a lot of talk about how this network of 5,000 public use airports around the United States is really our nation's largest underutilized infrastructure resource that we have, because most people don't use it, right? There's 600,000 pilots in the United States, right? Out of what, 350 million, however many.
That's still a huge number.
Yeah, but most people don't even know that those little airports exist, but they really have the potential. And with this new wave of these electric VTOL aircraft, those little airports will start to get more use, right? Because now they can be like the way that you get to the big airport. Go to a little airport, get on one of these things, fly you right
Got it. Yeah.
to the big airport. They're like what we call regional feeders to get you into the system. So there's a lot. But the big thing is, so this is going to be what we call the fourth revolution in aviation, but it's going to take like decade plus to really propagate through the entire system, because this is like, there's so many moving pieces in the system, from the FAA and the air traffic control system and how they certify aircraft, to the supply chain, to the infrastructure that's at all these little airports. Most of these little airports don't have charging facilities.
Right.
They have a gas station, right? Like that's it, right? So, all of those things have to change. And the economic incentive is getting there now, so that I think it's likely that they will change. But the timeline for that change there's still uncertainty associated with it. Like we're going to see the first operations probably happening in late 2024 of air taxis, these electric VTOL air taxis. But it's probably not going to be super common until the second half of this decade, right? And then it's still going to be probably just limited to like, okay, when you want to go to the airport, right?
Right.
But all of that is necessary to create the economic drivers to drive down the cost, to make it possible for the next venture, or maybe, the next product that we make to be like something that you could buy, right? Like,
right.
And I'm not saying we're going to do that, but I'm not saying we're not. So it all depends on how the market evolves and how the industry evolves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and the time scale in which all that stuff is going to happen, right? And there's just a lot of pieces that are in motion right now. So it's going to be really exciting to see how this all changes, because we're going to see, the one thing I can say with confidence is we're going to see a lot of change over the next 10 years, a whole lot of change in aviation that we haven't seen in a long time. Cool. People have been flying little, the Airbuses, and I don't mean the company, but like Boeings and Airbus. That's basically the only exposure that the average person has to airplanes. Right? Is taking a trip on one of those big things, right? That I expect to change over the course of the next 10 years. So that's going to be really cool.
Awesome. So to answer the question that everybody came here to hear about, you're saying sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to start seeing air taxis. And then maybe sometime between 10 and 20 years, this might start becoming more of a commonplace thing.
Yeah. I think the air taxi use case and like the first response use cases, these early market use cases will start happening, particularly in the second half of this decade.
Okay.
And so you could book a flight on an electric VTOL vehicle second half of this decade. Then for the personal use aircraft, you're probably talking, a little bit farther after everything else has matured a little bit more. And then it can propagate out to, personal ownership. Incidentally, there are shared use cases that are likely to become more viable. So anything where you share a cost with somebody else,
right?
Like all that stuff will become more financially viable before a personal ownership model will become financially viable.
Yeah,
right? That's just the economics.
That's just the way it is, right? Yeah,
that's just the way it is, right? So yeah,
cool. Well, Carl, we are over time. I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about here, but I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with me. Exciting space. Really excited to see what happens, not with JumpAero, but also in the entire industry as a whole. So thanks for being with us. And just really quick before we go off air, Carlos, do you want to give us our weekly announcements?
Yes, Eddie, thank you so much. Well, first of all, we have one more guest right here on Tech Backstage, which is the one below. We're going to be speaking with Corey Kozak, CEO of Aspire Ship, a job and reskilling placement platform specifically for the software as a service industry. So that'll be right here on Tech Backstage tomorrow at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. Remember, mark your calendars. Don't miss it. Be here. Have fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Carlos.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
Carl, thanks again for being here with us. Really enjoyed the chat today, and hope you have a good rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Eddie. Thanks so much, Carlos.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sean.
See you.